Hello everyone, this is Space Café podcast, and I'm Marcus. So, I was waiting for the guest of this episode to arrive at our recording location, the 8th floor of a WeWork co-working space in Austin, Texas. My guest texts me that she'll be 10 minutes late. Take your time, I text her back. My gear is set up and I have some time to kill, so I grab a cup of coffee. A couple of minutes later, I hear the elevator door open. My guest greets me with a big smile and introduces me to a second person I wasn't expecting, at least not this time. Matt, a friend, she says. 5 minutes later, the truth is revealed. Matt is a Green Beret, a Special Forces guy. I believe my guest was simply trying to ensure that during her appointment with me on the 8th floor in that American city where only those who conceal their weapons rather than displaying them openly are subject to strict law enforcement, she would be met on friendly terms. I assured her that being European, I would come unarmed, leaving both my real and metaphorical weapons under the table. Shawna Pandya is such a treat, such a delight. A true chill of all trades.
Thank you so much. That was fun.
Dr. Shawna Pandya is a scientist-astronaut candidate with Project PoSSUM, physician, aquanaut, speaker, martial artist. She wouldn't have needed a Green Beret. Advanced diver, skydiver, pilot in training, and a fellow of the Explorers Club. To be honest, I see my own life spiraling out of control into the vastness of empty space and nothingness in the face of all this. Anyhow, we covered lots of topics. Sex in space, the secrets behind great leadership, space medicine, the challenges of long-duration space travel, and the ethical implications of human reproduction in space. They're just some of many topics we touch upon in this episode, and boy, did I enjoy that conversation. Off we go. Enjoy.
Our second station was a unwinterized tent in the middle of the Utah desert in January.
Wow.
Yeah, so we had some really good people on that mission, ones that we're friends with to this day. That's where, there were, it was 2 weeks, but honestly, the lessons that we learned could fill a book. After we escaped from Mars, we were set free from this habitat where we were confined together for 2 weeks. A day after that, we willingly, the four of us, went into an escape room in Grand Junction and, willingly went into isolation confinement again together. Wow. And we won the escape room. But it was, that's the kind of bonds you forge with the right crew. Yeah.
Super. Let's jump right in.
Yeah, let's jump into it.
Let's do it. Super. Yeah. Thanks for taking the time in the first place.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, my pleasure.
So we were, I was going to talk about sex in space, but you just told us that beautiful story of yours when you were doing that simulation in the desert. Yeah. So how is that? What does it feel like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So
did everyone come out alive, or did you have bodies to leave behind?
I mean, as the official record is, we didn't leave anyone behind that we're willing to say publicly. No, I joke. That was my third expedition in an analog or analogous to space-like environment at that point. So I'd done a previous rotation at the Mars Desert Research Station as a medical officer. Mm-hmm. I had been on an underwater aquanaut mission, again as a medical officer, and this is the first time I stepped in as a commander. This was a 2-week sojourn, and there's just so many lessons learned. It was incredible. It was challenging when you make mistakes as a leader, and you will. They're on full display for everyone to see, and it's kind of how you admit to those, how you make a plan to not do that again. That kind of helps you be better the next time.
How do you get yourself to be accepted as a leader? Do people just subordinate themselves, or would they challenge you also?
People will challenge you. And so what was really cool on that mission is that, it was my first time as a commander, and we went into it definitively saying that we're actually going to test a different couple models of governance. We're going to test a military model where it's hierarchical, and then we're also going to switch halfway through and build it on consensus building. And you can say those things, but they evolve organically regardless. Mm-hmm. And on every mission, your group dynamic is different. You have to work very, very hard to build it. Even when you have a great crew, one that you are lifelong friends with, you have to work with intention to say, well, how are we going to build that cohesion as a group? And one thing that we did at the beginning of that mission that was very helpful is we actually sat down and said, what are our success criteria? And then we compared notes. So we developed a shared model of what we thought success was. And so then in that way, you're kind of hitting the ground running, because you're saying, well, this is where we disagree. This is where we agree from the start. And then you can sort of start building that path together. So in some respects, when you're trying to, your job as a leader isn't to lead from the front, yell at the troops, this is what you want, this is the results, why aren't you getting it? When I talk about leadership, I talk about leadership as a mortar between the bricks model. And the reason I call it that is when you look at a brick wall, it's so easy to think that the strength of that brick wall comes from the bricks themselves. But when you take away the mortar, without that mortar holding the wall together, there's no strength. That wall falls down. And so when I talk about leadership as a mortar between the bricks model, your job as a leader is to be that mortar, to look for gaps that need to be filled, to fill those gaps, whether it's in your job description or not, and to also forge relationships and connections between other parts of the team. And that's how you present yourself as a cohesive unit. So that's my approach to leadership. And hopefully it comes across in the missions, that I take part of, whether I'm there as a leader in an official capacity, whether I'm a teammate, whether I'm practicing followership. So that's, I think, the genesis of how I approach my leadership roles.
So what can we learn from you? What can leaders learn from you? Can you give us a couple of examples as to how to behave properly as a leader down here on Earth, in a corporation, in a company, when things get tense and difficult?
Absolutely, yeah. And so, to preface this, for those who don't know me, a lot of what I do is operational. I'm an emergency room physician. I've been in the OR, in the operating room. I've dealt with life or death situations. I've flown planes. I have my solo skydiving license. I'm an aquanaut diver. I've been in all these austere environment expeditions. So I like to think that I know a little bit about austere environments, about operational environments, and about decision-making as a leader and as the teammate. So when we talk about principles of leadership, there are so many. And I think the first thing is to give yourself permission to just acknowledge what success looks like, what failure looks like, and more importantly, that these are two sides of the same coin. Because success isn't always pretty and success isn't always perfect. And every one of our successes, we still can debrief and learn lessons to either reinforce a pattern of performance that we'd like to replicate in the future, or when we have suboptimal outcomes, there's still lessons to be learned. So whether you're talking about, a failure that wasn't, and did not end up in the outcome that you wanted it to, versus a success that wasn't optimal, the commonality is you're always learning and you're always trying to make yourself better for the next time. So that's the first leadership lesson. Whenever I'm talking to anyone, whether it's, students, whether it's talking to teams, corporate groups, is, you will fail. And a friend of mine, she's a fighter pilot. She's one of Canada's 7th female fighter pilots. And she says, if you've never failed, you're either lucky, lying, or Jesus himself. So we all fail. Right? And sort of how do you approach?
And it's okay to fail.
It's okay to fail.
And necessary.
It's necessary. And, when I'm giving talks on this subject, I have an entire slide that says in big letters, it is okay to fail. Right? And it's so important to acknowledge that, because when we think about success, when we talk about, setting a goal, it's so many of us fall into this trap of thinking we go from point A to point B, that, we set a goal, we work really, really hard, and then that's what success is. When in reality, it's a circuitous path of going 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 10 steps forward, 15 steps back. It is not a straight arrow. It is a very circuitous path. And managing our expectations is part of that knowing that we're going to deal with hardship. And then as we delve deeper into this journey of getting to success, how do we prepare ourselves for that hardship? When we talk about mental rehearsal, often we hear about visualization, the power of positive thinking, but we don't talk about rehearsing and preparing ourselves for the worst case scenarios. And we need to do that in order to be prepared for anything we might face. And then to break that down a step further is not just visualizing overcoming difficult scenarios, but breaking it down so we have a step-by-step plan. And then this actually really ties into research around resilience, which for those who aren't familiar with the topic, it's like that stick-to-itiveness, that perseverance, that willingness to push on, even when the going's tough, whether you're performing really, really well and want to keep up that pattern of performance or whether you're at rock bottom. And so the research around resilience is the same things. It's, mental rehearsal for the best and worst case scenarios. It's impulse control, resisting that urge to give up. It's breaking things down, not so you're focusing on the end goal, but getting there step by step. And it's also that positive self-talk, saying, I've got this, and then relying on your team, saying that, my team's in my corner as well. Who can I get to help me with this problem?
Wonderful. Can we go back to the analog mission?
Yes. We strayed a little bit from that.
What was a typical day in that mission like?
Yeah. So what we did...
What was it good for, the mission in the first place? So who was it done for?
Yeah. So we went through an organization that organized analog missions. And for me, I had done 2 analog missions. I'd previously been to the Mars Desert Research Station. So for me, there were very specific things that I wanted out of this mission. And one was, I'd been there twice as a crew medical officer in various, underwater and Mars-like environments. And now I wanted to say, well, how will I perform as a leader based on lessons learned? So for me, I wanted to test and hone my skills as a commander, as well as do it with a good set of people. And so this organization had been familiar with my work, and they said, hey, we need a commander for this upcoming mission. And so they asked me to step in. And one interesting thing and one lesson learned, I was asked to step in 3 weeks before the mission. Which, yeah, you're laughing because, and I, in retrospect, I laugh too because, there's a lot of planning that goes into mission success. So you're being thrown into these team dynamics, very, very different backgrounds, very different expectations, different levels of familiarity with research, and you're trying to manage all that. You're trying to build that same mental model of success. You're trying to build cohesion. And then you're also trying to deal with different stakeholders and their criteria for success, which may at times be cohesive to your own vision for success. Sometimes it may be competing. So then you're trying to constantly juggle that and manage those relationships and make sure that, if there's disagreement, it's not negatively impacting the team from day to day. So that's the underlying basis with which we approach that mission. And then from day to day, we have an operational schedule. We come in with the science. We come in with arts objectives. We come in with the overall mission objective, which in that case was the first station-to-station mission, by which we mean in the simulation, we had established a brand new station on Mars. And we were seeing how these 2 crews interacted, how they functioned as their own. And then bringing it back to Earth, the realities of the discomfort of this is our generator failed in the first few days, and then our solar panels, which were supposed to be our backup, failed. So we were operating in complete heat or in complete darkness. Our electricity wasn't working. Our heat was going to start to fail in the middle of the desert in January. And then the second station, which was a tent, and it was a non-winterized tent in the middle of the desert.
Not good.
Yeah, not good. And then sort of like, this is what we have to work with. How do we safety-proof ourselves? Because the first mission objective that we established, and we all agreed on, was safety. It was safety, then science, and outreach, and then having a little bit of fun as well. So fun was in there. It just wasn't the top priority. So then coming back to safety, it's sort of like, okay, well, a very real risk is hypothermia. How do we mitigate against that? What supplies do we need to make a run for to make sure that this mission can be successful and safely successful? So I guess, the bigger lesson there is, adapting and overcoming. Like you can't go into any operational scenario and expect it to be perfect. Like no one who's been in an operational environment will describe to you a perfect scenario that they've ever had. So you have to expect that things are going to come up. And it's sort of like, how am I going to adapt to this? It's like being on a gyroscope. You are constantly in motion, and you just need to constantly adapt your balance so that you can adapt to what the situation needs.
On a scale from 1 to 10, how ready are you, how ready are we to replicate that on Mars?
As humans?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I think as humans, it's hard to answer that question. Some are very ready. I think it depends on what your objectives are. Like if we wanted to send humans to Mars and we didn't care about survivability, we could launch tomorrow, right? And then it's sort of like, well, what are your objectives? How much do you trust the habitat to be radiation proof? How much do you trust your in situ resource utilization and production? How much do you trust the fidelity of your life support system? Are you okay with a 98% closed loop life support system versus a 99.9% closed loop life support system? How rigidly are you going to how rigidly are you going to select your crew? Because if you say anyone who wants to go to Mars, sometimes in operational environments or even, on Survivor on TV, you see people who put themselves in these environments against adversity simply because they want to test their boundaries, but they've never been in any type of survival scenario before.
Sure.
They've never prepared themselves for it. So when you talk about how ready we are to go, some people have been preparing for this their entire lives. They are survivalists. They've been in austere environments. They know how to be resourceful. They have that survival mentality. Some people could absolutely do it, today.
Individually, but not as a team.
As a team, there's certain teams who would have trained to do this. But as humans, if you were to say there's an asteroid coming to Earth, the only survival option is to transport all of us to Mars. Yeah. Probably not ready as a species to take us out of our comfort zones and put us into a place that's high radiation, 38% gravity, does not have a Starbucks in every corner. like you have to go through the mental thought experiment to really understand what it means to take on a 3 to 5 year mission to Mars, to take on a one-way trip to Mars. It is a 6 to 9 month journey simply to get there with today's technologies. Right. And then once you're there, you will never step on grass again.
No, you can't open the window.
You're not going to, you can do anything once, but if you only could open that window once.
Once, yeah. So you're trapped inside a trailer.
You are, right? And some people...
For the rest of your life.
Right. But some people can adapt to that, right? And sort of like, well, what are my goals? If you're mission focused and every day you're doing something to contribute to the mission, if you're doing something to make your crewmates' lives a little bit better, then, a 3 to 5 year mission is perfectly survivable. And there's people, who do military deployments, for long term, maybe 18 months at a time, right? And, who live on research ships in the middle of the sea, right? And they're used to that austerity. And they have a routine for keeping themselves healthy and not just surviving, but thriving in that environment. So there are people who thrive in that kind of environment. And then interestingly enough, one of my areas of research is in psychology and resilience in austere environments. And there's this concept of salutogenesis. And what that means is a person who views austerity as an opportunity for growth, an opportunity to rise to the occasion. It's like, and views this as fulfilling. So there are people who have the mindset for whom a Mars mission, they would get a lot out of it. It would be incredibly fulfilling, but they would also thrive in that environment.
How about you personally? Would you go?
It honestly depends on the mission parameters. If it's simply to be the first on Mars, but there's not much thought into the safety, the mission objectives, the science, and it's simply for the glory, that doesn't interest me. But if there's defined objectives that I agree with, and that you've run the engineering and the risks, there will always be risk, but it's how have we acknowledged, mitigated, and managed those risks? What is the safety plan? With the right mission context, I would absolutely go. Yeah.
Apart from the technical hurdles to make a habitat on Mars safe, what is, in your opinion, from working with teams, from leading teams, what is the greatest issue? Especially when it comes to friction, human friction, where are we the issue as a human species?
Yeah. So within my experience in teams, I think it's acknowledging every single member of their team, knowing their strengths, knowing their weaknesses, knowing how they would like to be communicated with if something's gone wrong. And these are discussions we've had on previous missions. We would debrief at the end of the day. And then one thing that came up is some team members preferred to talk about errors and issues in a group setting so we could all learn. And then there were some members who said, I find that personally like I'm being, put on the spot, even though that's not the intent. I would rather you talk to me one-on-one about it. So finding the nuance of how each teammate needs to be integrated into the team to perform at their best. And you're always coming back to that principle of how do we optimize this team to perform together and to meet our goals. So that's kind of the approach that I've taken that, has built up a lot. And then the other part of it is realizing that coming back to this concept of we're always going to make mistakes. When you're a commander, when you're a leader, when you're a teacher, when you're a parent, you will make mistakes. And those mistakes are on display for everyone to see. And if you don't own up to it, you're going to lose trust. You're going to lose respect. People are going to stop believing in you. And, if you're in this little closed environment on a Mars simulation,
You better deliver.
Yeah, you're going to have mutiny on your hands.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a variety of reasons people will disagree with you. Maybe they genuinely feel you're doing something unsafe, in which case, that's a discussion that needs to be had. Maybe it's something about, there's a personality conflict that isn't, someone just doesn't like the way you look that day. And, I've seen that play out too. And you always have to manage these things. So when it comes to making a mistake, coming back to that point, the way I find acknowledging is acknowledge the mistake, apologize for it, say, I am sorry, do it with integrity, but then also have a plan to make sure that doesn't happen or that you're prepared for it going forward. And then if there's individual frictions, in one expedition I'm planning, it was the crew that we get along very well. But there were things that need to be optimized. So we said, let's have an airing of grievances. And then someone said, well, that sounds kind of unproductive because it sounds like we're just kind of ragging on the mission and each other. And then someone was saying, somehow the analogy of sunscreen came in. And we said, well, we're actually just sunburn proofing ourselves for future tense situations. So why don't we have a sunscreen session? So we're, proofing ourselves against tough situations. And that was a lot more productive. So you can deal with friction points. And then if you approach it from the perspective of we're doing it to make sure that we're prepared the next time we deal with a hurdle or face a hurdle, makes it a lot more focused and productive.
Is there any research or insight on the type, not only team size, but also, is it better to have mixed teams? Is it better to have all male teams, all female teams?
Yeah, there's a lot of research around that. One of my favorite books is called Humans in Space. It's by Nick Canis. He's a psychologist. He's done lots of research on this. And interestingly enough, so there's research that says heterogeneous, mixed gender crews are more productive. So I know, when we talk about, challenges of reproduction and sexuality in space, well, some people say, well, why don't you send a single gender crew to Mars? But we know productively that the heterogeneous and mixed gender crews tend to be more productive. And then on the flip side, I once came across some research that said culturally homogeneous crews there tends to be less conflict. And so that I brought that up to an astronaut friend once, and he said, yeah, that's what the research says, but I had a very mixed crew, and these people are my brothers and sisters, and I would do anything for them. And so, you also have to, you can acknowledge the research, but you should also acknowledge what each crew dynamic is going to be individual to that crew. So there's a lot of research, and it's really interesting because you can get really down into the weeds. When you look at mixed cultural crews, there's even research about what the preferred speaking distances between each crew. Some cultures, speak very, very closely that to you or me might be infringing on our comfort zone, whereas some people prefer distance. Some cultures, speak in a very authoritative, this is the plan kind of way. Some cultures don't respond to that. So being mindful that there's always going to be these factors and potential friction points, I think is the biggest takeaway from this, and saying, see that, this is a blind spot that I had when it comes to crew relations and leadership. And if it becomes a friction point, acknowledge that, it is a friction point and deal with it and move on.
Would it make sense to bring happily married couples?
I get asked that a lot, and I've heard pros and cons for and against this. I hear a lot of pros because, when we talk about a long duration mission, bring a married couple because then they're not missing their spouse back on Earth. They know how each other's works.
Sexuality is covered.
And then you have to ask the awkward question, well, what happens if they separate mid-mission? Then it becomes awkward. Then it becomes a crew problem, right?
Right.
And so there's pros and cons against it. So I think it's something that should definitely be explored, right? Because if you're both high-functioning astronaut candidate material, you are both made it into the astronaut corps, and now you're being asked to go on a 5-year mission. Ostensibly, you're good operationally, and then you're good interpersonally. So I think it makes sense. I would like to see it play out, for sure. Yeah.
Sexuality in space, how does science answer the obvious question? If you have mixed teams, how do you deal with affections for one another? We're built as human beings to check out the other. So do you medicate against that? Hormonal treatments to suppress my interests?
Yeah, there's a million answers to that question. So some people say, well, only send single gender crews for that reason. Well, then you might have a question like, what if, someone says, I would like to explore a same-sex relationship on Mars? So then they say that they do that. There's no risk of pregnancy, but now say it's a mixed culture crew and a very, very conservative culture is offended by this, and that creates crew friction. So you're not necessarily circumventing a problem by sending a single gender crew. So then there's research that says, well, engineer the crew quarters on Mars for less privacy, so then no one has an opportunity to fraternize. But then there's opposing research that says that...
but the lack of privacy does not get rid of my human needs.
It doesn't get rid of the needs, and it actually makes crews less productive.
Yeah.
So then that's a problem as well. So then there's research that says, well, send only menopausal females or, people who've had vasectomy, so they can't get pregnant. So then that answers one question, but what happens if the two people engaging in a relationship have been married back on Earth and now they're having an extramarital Martian affair, right? And then this is a taxpayer-funded mission. Well, then what is the duty for the sponsoring agency to inform the stakeholders and the taxpayers? So at any way you swing it, there's going to be conflict. Yeah. And that's why it's so important, both within the confines of an agency-sponsored mission versus within the confines of a commercially funded mission. Like, we need to start asking these questions, because can you mandate that everyone has to be on birth control? Can you mandate no fraternization? If someone does become pregnant, can you mandate the termination of that pregnancy, where we would, we wouldn't do that depending on the circumstance and the laws on Earth. And then, if you go forward with that pregnancy, now you're saying, well, maybe the pregnant astronaut is going to take maternity leave, but now your life support system is working harder to support an additional crew member. You're now feeding a crew of +1. Or are you going to evacuate? What are the logistics of an increased G-load of launch and landing on a pregnant astronaut? So any way you swing it, there are so many considerations. Maybe
we're not meant to leave this place.
Maybe we're not, but this is where commercial astronautics and the commercial industry becomes really interesting, because humans are innately competitive and somebody always wants to be the first. And so even to date, if no one is taking credit for having had sexual relations in space, someone will want to. And someone will want to be the first to have had intercourse in space. Someone will want to be the first to have had conceived in space. Someone will
First baby in space.
First baby in space, right? These are all firsts. And to a certain degree, we can mandate, well, you're 36 weeks pregnant. We won't let you get on a transatlantic flight. We won't let you get on a space flight. But one of the companies I advise is building the world's first space hotel. Just as we can't mandate what people do and don't do in the privacy of their hotel rooms on Earth, we probably can't mandate what they do and don't do in space hotels in orbit around Earth. So someone at some point is going to have relations in space. And even if we've been saying all along, we don't want to think about that, space is this scientific, sterile, professional environment, we're going to have to start thinking about it.
But maybe it's also something that helps us come to terms with that topic here on Earth, because it's still a topic we don't talk about publicly. It's very much under the sheets. Sexuality, it's not a public thing to talk about. Maybe in Europe it's a little better. Netherlands, Austria, Germany, we're maybe a little more open-minded. But I think what I hear is the greatest porn industry is in the United States, and at the same time, it's such an issue to talk about sexuality and the variations of sexuality.
Absolutely. And so I'm going to put my medical hat on for a second because I still practice clinically. I do a lot of women's health as well. And so one thing that changed my perspective about the way we view health was in second year medical school, I was introduced to the World Health Organization's definition of what it means to be healthy. And so many times when you think you're sick, I'm going to the doctor. But the WHO says being healthy is not merely the absence of disease. It's the presence of physical, spiritual, psychological well-being. And I would add to that sexual well-being. And then where that comes into play is I do a lot of women's health and as of recently, a lot of men's health. And so many people are embarrassed. And it is my job to let them know this is nothing to be embarrassed about. It is my job to be frank, upfront, and let them know we are here to help you solve a problem, no matter how sensitive it is, no matter how embarrassed they are about rectal health, prostate health, gynecological health. And then what's really heartbreaking is culturally, for example, I come from a Southeast Asian culture where, we're not told about women's health. We're not told about sexual health. We're not told about mental health. These things are taboo. And literally, I've had conversations with women and men from all cultures. And for example, a woman will have a heavy, painful period, and her doctor, who's from a certain culture, will say, well, I don't want to start you on birth control pills because that would make you promiscuous. And that is absolutely wrong. This is a medical issue. This is an option to treat your medical issue. And we need to take away the stigma to let you know that we're here to talk about this frankly in a way that helps you solve your problem. So when you're talking about how we need to open up conversations about sexuality in space, you're right. We need to come out from under the sheets on Earth as well. And if we come to it from a point of destigmatization and instead approach it about problem solving with no embarrassment, that is absolutely the most productive track to take. And so for anyone who's out there listening who might have felt stigmatized or too embarrassed to go to the doctor, this is my call to action for you to find a doctor who will put you at ease so that you're both on the same page when it comes to problem solving, because that is what our aim is in medicine.
Because it's natural. It's
natural. And it's also natural to have problems. We're all going to have problems. That's why doctors exist. It's to help you solve those problems.
Let's go back to that space hotel.
Yeah.
When is it ready?
Yeah.
So when is it on booking.com?
A few years away yet. So I am a medical advisor to Orbital Assembly Corporation. So this is the world's first artificial gravity rotating space hotel. Straight out of Space Odyssey 2001, simple physics, V squared over R gives you partial gravity. It's just a matter of how fast you spin.
So it's that wheel,
it's a
white wheel.
Yeah. So by the end of the decade, we will have stations in orbit. We have a plan towards research platforms, both uncrewed and crewed. Our hope is to be a catalyst towards access to space for exploration, for entertainment, for entrepreneurship, for science. There's so many. What excites me is when we give humans platforms, they take it and run with it. We see that with social media. We see that with
the App Store.
But the App Store, we
Yeah.
see that with YouTube. And so space is the next great platform. And, to be part of an organization, a company that's building that future in space is exciting. And then the value add of, talking about partial gravity is we have 4 billion years worth of evolutionary evidence that says we tend to do pretty good in 1G. We have 60 years of human spaceflight data that says, well, there's some issues with microgravity, but we're still learning. But the giant question mark comes when we ask about partial gravity. How do humans adapt to 17% gravity on the moon, 38% gravity on Mars? We just don't know. And the best way I've heard it phrased comes from Jim Logan. He's a physician, former head of medical operations at Johnson Space Center. He said, what's the gravity prescription? How much gravity at what intervals for what duration and what frequency do we need to make this work? Whether you're talking about development, reproduction, whether you're talking about surviving and thriving on a different planet.
I'd love to hear your take on what is going on right now in the space industry, because we have that first, we had that first phase, the pioneers back in the Apollo days. Then space sort of was on pause, was on standby for a couple of decades. And now it's coming back massively because it's becoming commercial. So, and it's now, you mentioned back in the day, during the Apollo days, you had to be an athlete to be an astronaut. Today, it's different. Even handicapped people are considered becoming astronauts. And that's, of course, it's not only an interesting, I think it's necessary, because I think space, no gravity doesn't care if you can walk or cannot walk. And so that's very interesting. So where do you see the state of humanity when it comes to becoming interplanetary?
This is the most exciting time to be on the forefront of space exploration. As you were alluding to, this was once a part of a war. It was a show of technological superiority.
It wasn't about space. I think it was all about
it was an extension of what was going on Earth. It was a conflict between the U.S. and the Soviets.
Yeah.
And then over time, it became more about exploration, but it was still dominated by the big five, by Europe, Russia, Japan, Canada, NASA, the USA. And then when we look at what has happened, every few years I make a diaspora of all the countries with space agencies. And, in 2017, it was 70 plus. And then when I last revisited that in, a year ago, it was 90 plus countries with space agencies. Because whether we're sending humans to space or not, having access to space is a superpower. It's a form of economic development for infrastructure, for telecommunications, for monitoring our agricultural crop qualities and our soil quality as well. And so, having a presence in space is part of the future. Now, extending that to human spaceflight and specifically commercial spaceflight, there was a golden era of human spaceflight with pioneers. Yes, with the flight of Gagarin, with the flight of Shepard, with Apollo 11, with all of the Apollo missions. This is a new golden age, because since 2021, we have hit this inflection point of exponential rise in access to space and democratization of access to space. And it's been in that lag phase for quite some time. Those of us who watch the industry closely, have been on the edge of our seats since the mid-2000s. But in 2021, we saw Blue Origin send civilians to space. We saw Virgin send Branson and his crew to space. We saw Inspiration 4, the first all-civilian crew, go to space. And since then, it hasn't stopped. New Shepard has had more flights. We've sent, Wally Funk broke the record for the oldest person to space, 82. And then William Shatner, broke that record as a nonagenarian. So now we're changing, as you say, our perception of who goes to space. This is continuing. Axiom sent up its AX-1 mission. It's continuing on with an AX-2 mission. SpaceX is following up Inspiration 4 with Polaris Dawn. So the number of missions isn't slowing down. And now we're saying, okay, what if space wasn't just for the pilots and the engineers and scientists? What if we could send other people to space? What if we sent the artists and the entrepreneurs and the athletes? What kind of sports can we do in microgravity?
Well, what became of Elon's vision? He wanted to send artists around the moon.
Yeah, so the
is that still a thing?
Dear Moon Project is still a go. Steve Aoki is flying around the moon later this decade. That's a go. 8 artists are going to fly in cislunar orbit. So then, once upon a time, coming back to this idea of who gets to go to space. It used to be the healthiest of the healthy. I used to say that being an astronaut was a bit of a medical genetic lottery as well, and the path towards becoming a governmental space agency astronaut is littered with the hopes and dreams of medically disqualified candidates. Colorblind, you're out. Diabetes, you're out. You were iron deficient, you're out that year. Maybe you can come back in a future year. You're pregnant that year, well, you're good this year, but you can't continue with the selection. So there's any reason that you can be disqualified. And these are all true case studies I'm naming to you from previous NASA and Canadian Space Agency selections. And then someone somewhere said, what if? What if that didn't have to be the case, depending on the mission profile? Stephen Hawking flew 0G in parabolic flight in 2007, and he loved it. You just need to see the image of, his expression. And so then, since then, with suborbital flight, with the flight profile, we initially had centrifuge studies that backed up medically that folks from 18 to 89, folks with insulin pumps, folks with congenital heart defects who've had heart surgery, they all did well in these increased G profiles that mimicked a suborbital accelerated G profile, 6 Gs front to back. People did well. And the most common reason someone would be disqualified was claustrophobia, anxiety, having a panic attack, not doing something safe, or simply being unwilling to follow directions. So now that changes the profile because you're kind of looking from a medical risk standpoint, you're looking at what is the probability that something bad is going to happen. And in the context of suborbital flight from start to finish, it's not very high. You're more likely to have a medical issue en route on a transatlantic flight, which is much longer. So then that stratifies risk and says, well, suborbital flight is probably safe for most people with certain qualifiers. So then we extend that further and say, how does that translate to orbital flight? And the Inspiration 4 crew has all said very publicly, if this were a NASA selection, we would have been medically screened out. But they still, thrived for their several-day mission on orbit. I don't know the medical profiles of who went on the AX missions. But again, these are not your typical astronauts from a NASA or a Canadian Space Agency or ESA perspective. So to take that even a step further, then what about people who typically wouldn't have even been able to apply, those with physical disabilities, with amputations? And the European Space Agency did something momentous with its last selection. They issued the first ever call for para-astronauts, those with lower limb disabilities, amputations, limb length discrepancies, because as you say, in 0G, it doesn't matter. So they announced their first ever para-astronaut, along with their selection this year. And his credentials are amazing. He's a Paralympian. He's an orthopedic surgeon. He's a researcher. He puts the rest of us to shame. And so then, it's this question of saying, well, what if this person can do it? What if we can bring more with us? And then we see the rise of the Astro Access initiatives. They've flown 2 campaigns now with folks who have visual disabilities, hearing impairments, mobility issues, who might be paraplegic. And they've flown successfully on parabolic flight. And now, to take it a step even further, to build on these successes, I've had the privilege to become involved with the Norwegian Next Steps initiative. And this is the world's first commercial para-astronaut initiative. And if you look at the candidates, they are the best of the best. They are Paralympians. They're former Norwegian Special Forces police. They have mobility disabilities, but, their credentials are amazing. And, to be a part of this journey to help increase, to help catalyze this access to space is so exciting. And then on the other end of it, coming back to the concept of what happens when you give humans platforms in which to perform, microgravity and space being another one of them. What happens when you manufacture? What happens when you get creative? What happens when you send anyone, or at least make access easier? What can we create? I think that's what really excites me about the future of the democratization of access to space.
That's the beautiful part, democratizing societies, because here on Earth we're siloed we have people with disabilities, they're excluded from most of the things we do on Earth. But this gives us, or many different groups of society, a new start to become a new part of societies. And that's a beautiful idea to consider. What are the parts that are the tricky nuts we need to crack still, if on our way towards becoming that? I think interplanetary is still too far away, but becoming a species that settles down on the moon in the near future, what are the problems we need to take care of?
Yeah, the question always comes down to contextualization and nuance. What are we trying to achieve, and what are the risks involved in this particular mission profile? So coming back to my own field of expertise in space medicine, when we talk about how we frame the challenges of exploration class and deep space missions, we talk about the RIDGE framework. So we talk about increased radiation, isolation, confinement, distance from Earth, altered gravity, and everything else which falls under hostile environments, including lunar dust exposure, altered day-night cycles. So your lunar day-night cycle on the moon's equator is 14 days of day, 14 days of night. We know from the Apollo missions that the lunar regolith they encountered was a very potent skin, ocular, respiratory irritant. How do we mitigate those? Going a step further, talking about distance from Earth, light, even traveling at the speed of light, telecommunications can only travel so fast. So, depending on the alignment of Earth and Mars, you might be waiting 46 minutes to say hi, hello, and have that interaction. So that if you are a crew on Mars and you have a medical emergency and say it's your doctor that's incapacitated, who has a cardiac arrest, you absolutely cannot wait 46 minutes for a return call from Earth to say, please start chest compressions, because by then the window is past. So then our challenges going forward, are doing it in a stepwise fashion that is safe, that is scientifically sound, and that has a view towards progress and inclusivity. How do we manage that risk? How do we expand the avenues towards space? How do we do it in a way that's sustainable? If we're serious about the Artemis missions, creating a permanent off-world sustainable presence, permanent exploratory surface operations on the moon, what stepwise fashion do we build that up in? How do we build up the medical infrastructure to support that? What does a trauma bay on Mars look like? These are the questions that keep me up at night. So just the one-line summary is, come back to your first principles of what your objectives are, and then figure out how you do it safely, scientifically, and inclusively.
From an evolutionary perspective, do you think we would take a different route as a species once we're exposing ourselves to that new environment? So is there epigenetics going on? Would we grow different limbs or what?
Yeah, I don't know if we would develop more limbs in space, but that's a very important question to ask, because if we're going as a survival prerogative, and then we say, say somehow the science is advanced and we've proven that we can reproduce in altered G environments, and that someone, can successfully start a family on the moon, but it just means that they're a little bit taller and their bones are a little bit less adapted to G loads. Maybe it means they can't return to Earth. So then we're suddenly beginning to evolutionary diverge. And maybe you won't see that in the first generation. Maybe you look alike enough to a human and you're adapted enough still to 1G that your offspring, first generation on the moon, can still come back to Earth can still reproduce with humans born on Earth. But then maybe it's cumulative over generations between adaptation to an altered gene environment, exposure to increased radiation, and then maybe over time, we're creating a divergent humanity that is taller and can jump higher, but cannot adapt to the 1G environment. And maybe you don't see it immediately, but maybe you see it over time. And then there comes a philosophical question that if there's enough divergences, at what point do you start calling that a different species?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
I think there's an answer to it from an evolutionary perspective, a scientific answer. I think a species has a very clear boundary to the other species. I think it's about procreation, if I'm not mistaken.
It is. And then, that is the hard and fast scientific rule. And then you hear these anecdotes from the animal kingdom all the time where you hear these species that were not supposed to be able to mate have come back and mated.
Yeah.
So it's not a hard and fast rule. So it does, it does bear questions, because even if we're using that as the hard and fast rule, saying that, 6 generations down, a 6th generation lunar being can no longer procreate with a human, a Terran human. Well, what about the 5th generation?
Wow.
Did that divergence happen somewhere between generations 5 and 6?
Fascinating.
Fascinating to think about.
This, again, I'm asking a question as to if it's a good idea to leave our planet, because we're opening buckets of worms, not cans of worms.
I think there's just 2 imperatives in answer to that question. The first one is a survival imperative. And there's that joke that if you're in the space industry, you've heard that the dinosaurs didn't have a space program. Yeah. Where are they now, right? So you can't. Right now, we have 8 billion eggs in one Terran basket here on Earth. So there's a survival imperative to, spread humans across the universe. But then it's also, I think, a fundamental question of what it means to be human. We ask, what if? What happens if I do this? What happens if I explore there? Well, now that I've been there, what if I go a step further? That's how we've gotten to where we are. Someone said, what if I, construct this? What if I build a wheel? What if I eat this plant? What if I extract this medication from this plant? What if I purify it? That's how aspirin came from the willow bark, right? That's how we discover things. So I don't think, that being a fundamental human trait, I don't think we're going to stop exploring. And then, just the survival imperative hopefully will propel us to do that sooner rather than later.
As a physician, do you advise against or pro procreation in space? Should we have kids in space?
We should do it in a way that is ethically and scientifically sound and safe. And so, Egbert will tell you with Spaceborne, the initial proposal of the company was to take a woman in her 3rd trimester and induce labor in low Earth orbit to have the first off-world birth. And as a physician who's seen things gone horribly wrong in low risk, in air quote, labors on Earth, you might lose the heartbeat. You might have to perform a crash C-section. You might have to do a forceps delivery. You might have to repair a bad tear. You might have to you might have a mass hemorrhage and need to transfuse many units. Hopefully, this is getting people's hearts racing with anxiety, because now imagine doing that in low Earth orbit. You don't want to do that. So then, Spaceborne, now what they're doing is much more stepwise, crawl, walk, run, fly, proposing starting with research on embryos and how they respond to the spaceflight environment. I think that's a much more sound and safe and ethical way to do it. And so when, at some point, a human is going to be born off Earth, and hopefully what we've done and what we've compelled people to do with our calls for more action on research and reproduction and sexuality on Earth is help build up that base of research so we're not caught unawares when the first human in space is born. By then we'll have funded much more of these studies which have already happened with embryos, with salamanders, with jellyfish, with zebrafish in space, and we'll have sorted out all of this conflicting data on there's increased death amongst offspring, there's increased issues with development. No, there isn't. There's so much data out there from shuttle from Skylab, from Mir, that's conflicting, that we need to sort out. And so, yes, at some point, humans are going to procreate in space. But if we know from the magnitude of data that it cannot happen safely without a high risk of birth defects in the zero-G environment, then maybe let's dial it back a bit and say, well, what if we start with experiments in 0.5G, in 1/3 G? And, if 1/3 G works, what about 1/6 G? So that's what I mean by
slowly dialing it up.
Yeah, approaching this in a stepwise, scientific, safe manner.
What up next for you, for Shawna, professionally?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am continuing my austere environment work. I have a few expeditions to announce over the coming months. Very excited to be part of those. Continuing with the research that we're doing for space medicine. I'm part of a research group that will be flying a pupilometer aboard the Polaris Dawn missions with SpaceX. So very excited about that. Have a few payloads related to manufacturing in space, building foam in space. That's a student payload. And then hopefully getting to space myself soon.
So you ready for it?
I was ready yesterday. And then beyond that, contributing to medical infrastructure in deep space in a meaningful way that leaves a legacy for generations to come, and then bringing those medical advances to our most remote, rural, and resource-limited locales on Earth.
Fascinating. For that long, boring journey ahead of you, what tune for a Spotify playlist would you want to bring along? The one tune. By the way, we do have that Spotify playlist. So I started it a couple of months ago.
Okay.
And there's a Spotify playlist for the future space traveler.
Wonderful.
And so I'm asking you, which tune should I introduce to that playlist?
Okay, so it's a little bit cliche. There's 2 cliches on there. So you definitely need To the Moon and Back by Savage Garden, because that, if you're going to the moon, you need that song. Black Holes and Revelations, Starlight by Muse, very fitting. And then if you just want a non-space but masterpiece of rock, of music, of alt rock, my favorite band of all time is Linkin Park, and they remixed their first album and they called it Reanimation, and it is a masterpiece. It's something that needs to be listened to from start to finish, and it is a 90-minute journey of just audio prowess. It is very immersive. So that's something I've listened to over and over from start to finish, and I think would be perfect for a long duration space journey.
Wonderful. The show is called the Space Café Podcast. It's a coffee place. And you go to coffee places now and tend to have an espresso to energize yourself because you're tired, you want more energy. So why don't you share an espresso for the mind with us, with me, with the audience, to energize our minds, inspiration. You can pick whatever kind of topic you want to pick.
I think my shot of espresso, hopefully it's a double shot of espresso, this is the time to be involved with space. Even if you thought that your particular journey doesn't have a space in place, maybe you're a storyteller, we still need you. So look at the trajectory of space. Think about what we've discussed today. Think about what you want space exploration to look like in 2025, 2030, 2050. And then figure out what role you want to have in that journey and how you're going to architect that future of space, because you absolutely have a place in space. It's up to you to realize that journey.
Shawna, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
It's extremely interesting to chat with you. So you're such a great communicator.
Thank you so much.
Wow.
It was fun.
Thank you, my friends, for joining us on this fascinating and inspiring episode of the Space Café podcast. Our guest, Shawna Pandya, has given us a unique perspective on space medicine, the challenges of long-duration space travel, and the ethical implications of human reproduction in space. As we look toward the future of space exploration, it's clear that individuals from all backgrounds have a role to play in shaping this exciting new frontier. So, Whether you're a scientist, an engineer, storyteller, or simply someone who dreams of the stars, remember that you have a place in space. Don't forget to follow our Spotify playlist for future space travelers, curated by our guests' favorite tunes, and be sure to subscribe to the Space Café podcast for more engaging conversations on the latest developments in space, science, and technology. Once again, thank you, Dr. Shawna Pandya, for sharing her insights and experiences with us. This is your host, Marcus, signing off until our next cosmic adventure. Stay curious, my friends, stay inspired, and keep reaching for the stars. Bye-bye.